So Harsha Walia is going to be our final keynote for today for the conference, and we're really excited to have her. You all might recall Harsha's book on Undoing Border Imperialism, but she also has another book coming out called Bordering Rule, and it's on migration capitalism and nationalism. But just a little bit about Harsha Walia so that you know who she is as she comes into this talk is she's organized in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, feminist, abolitionist, and anti-imperialist movements for the past 2 decades on unceded Coast Salish territories. We're very excited to have you, Harsha, and I'm just going to give it away to you. We're all very excited to have you, and we're so thankful that you were able to make time for us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And just first, my deep appreciation for all of the time and effort that's gone into organizing this conference. I'm so excited and looking forward to it. And it really is, such a treat to be able to speak into a space where open borders and no borders is the starting premise of the conversation, because of course, so much of our work is the work of talking about and convincing people about the necessity of having no borders. And I should be explicit that, for me, the difference between open borders and no borders is not a semantic one, and that there is a difference, but that won't be the focus of my talk. But I hope that as I'm speaking, you will be able to understand why, for me, I come more explicitly from a no borders perspective than an open borders one. And before I start as well, I want to, as was mentioned, recognize that I'm here on unceded Coast Salish territories. These are the lands of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish people. And those are the Indigenous nations who continue to steward these lands, who've been here since time immemorial, and who have jurisdiction, in my view, over in the territories in which I reside. And I know that talking about Indigenous sovereignty can often be seen as antithetical or in opposition to the principle of free movement. But for me, it really is central to think through those things together and to look at the ways in which migration has really impacted the ways in which we think about Indigenous nationhood and the ways in which we think about what Indigenous sovereignty means. I'm going to try so hard to speak slow. I'm so used to speaking incredibly fast, and I know that's so hard for interpreters, and thank you so much to the interpreters for your work in interpreting. So I'd like to start by first thinking through the ways in which we talk about the US-Mexico border. So of course, there's been so much work done over many years in thinking through and analyzing and organizing against the southern US border. But the reasons that I'd like to revisit that in brief is specifically to look at the ways in which the construction of that border is fundamentally bound up in anti-Indigenous and anti-Black genocides. And for me, this is important because oftentimes we think about, particularly in the North American context, organizing around migrant justice struggles as somehow separate from anti-Indigenous and anti-Black violence, right? So we think about anti-Black violence as encompassing, for example, work around the prison industrial complex, work with respect to Indigenous rights as encompassing, land defense and water protection work, and then anti-border work as the work of migrant justice struggles. That's, of course, an oversimplification, but to me, the ways in which organizing against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous warfare is fundamentally bound up in border struggles or anti-border struggles is really important for us to think through so that we start to see these movements as necessarily intertwined. And that goes beyond simply thinking about the ways in which we are impacted by systemic racism, right? So not just that migrants and Indigenous communities and Black communities are all impacted by racism, but that there's a fundamental way in which these material structures are bound up in each other. So I want to start with that just as a way to open up an expansive conversation around anti-border and no border struggles specifically. So in the U.S. context, as we all know, again, so much has been done and talked about with respect to the southern border. But I want to emphasize the actual kind of construction of the border and really go back into interrogating the history of and the formation of the border. So as I mentioned, I want to focus on the ways in which the construction of the border and the formation of the border is bound up in anti-Indigenous and anti-Black violence that then informs the ways in which migrant exclusion becomes part and parcel of how we understand the border, the southern US border. So of course, the first thing is that it's impossible to talk about the formation of the US-Mexico border as it is currently understood outside of the context of conquest, right? So, the annexation of territory in the mid 1800s that has, that now informs the southern U.S. So the annexation of territory that led to the creation of what we now know as most of Texas, of Arizona, of Colorado, right? Hundreds of thousands of acres of land were annexed by the U.S. settler government. And so, a lot of that forced annexation of territory, over 525,000 square miles of territory that forms now the present day U.S.-Mexico border. That, of course, is the first way in which we understand the formation of the border, right? That it is completely bound up in a territorial conquest, a project of territorial conquest. And that project of territorial conquest was very specifically framed around settler colonialism and anti-Black enslavement. So, just dating back, if we go back to the 1830s, Mexico's decision to outlaw slavery and refuse Anglo-settler immigration from the southern US is what really was one of the main factors in fueling the Texian movement, right? So that was the attempts of Texas to secede from Mexico at the time. And as we know, one of the things that led to was the full-blown U.S. military invasion of Mexico, and then also debt manipulation by President James Polk that led to then the annexation and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, right? So it's impossible to think about the formation of the U.S. border outside of the project of conquest. The other pieces that I wanted to touch on is how important it is to think about border formation through the process of Indigenous elimination. So the Red Nation, people may be familiar with their work. They're an organization of Indigenous activists and Indigenous organizers. And one of their slogans is "No one is illegal on stolen land except those who stole it." And I think that's a really profound statement in thinking through the ways in which the imposition of the border really was intended to further the project of Indigenous elimination, right? And one of the ways in which we saw that clearly and continue to see that is the imposition of the border on Indigenous nations and territories, really completely devastating Indigenous migration, right? So Indigenous nations who have historically moved, who have migrated, who continue to move, have been impacted by the imposition of a border. And this continues in the contemporary era with the struggles of the Tudoniodam and the southern border, who have so valiantly and courageously been confronting the U.S.-Mexico border wall, right? But that is not new. That dates back to the very imposition of the border on Indigenous nations and the annexation of Indigenous territories. The other thing that I think is important to mention about the ways in which the border and really the entire regime of immigration and citizenship is fundamentally tied up in settler colonialism specifically is the very fact that citizenship was imposed on Indigenous nations. And in the US, the very method by which immigration and citizenship was imposed on Indigenous nations was through the Dawes Act. And this very neatly tied in settler colonialism to the entire project of capitalism as well, right? So the 1887 Dawes Act, which allowed Indigenous people to become US citizens, but only if they agreed to live on individual plots of land carved up by the United States government and the administration as a method of private property, right? So communally held land, and this is something we see happening all around the world, the kind of enclosures of the commons, the capitalist method of ensuring that private property is our dominant economic regime, the removal of communal and social organization of property relations that are not capitalist, that method of dovetailing capitalism and settler colonialism, or really kind of tying them together, is something that we saw as well, right? So citizenship was both forced on Indigenous peoples, and that citizenship was specifically connected to capitalist modes of production, right? So really establishing private property and the kind of entire regime of land registry as a capitalist function. So that is really central to understanding the function of the border and really the entire project of citizenship in the United States, and how neatly those are connected together. The other thing that I think is important to note is also the ways in which Indigenous peoples, particularly in the 1800s, but of course this continues today, but just to look at it through historical lens, were actually viewed as deportable illegal immigrants, right? So Indigenous peoples who were traveling up through what then became Mexico and what was then starting to form as the Canadian nation state. So for example, the Chippewas and the Yaquis and the Crees were coming into what became the United States. So these communities of Indigenous people actually waged really historic battles against anti-deportation struggles, right? And so I think this really shows the ways in which deportation is not only about migrants or quote unquote foreigners, but it captures a whole lot of people, and that it's fundamentally more about power, right? It's more about power than anything else. And this, of course, is true today as well. Shannon Speed has written an incredible book in the contemporary era where she talks about the ways in which migration of Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous peoples from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, throughout South and Central America, essentially gets erased or collapsed or subsumed into a kind of pan-Latinx identity when we don't think about the specificity of Indigenous migration within the broader context of migration, right? So as we know, a huge proportion of migrants, and increasingly so, who are coming to the southern border are Indigenous peoples, right? Who are not Spanish speaking, for example. And what Shannon Speed calls it a transit between settler state structures. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, because again, the ways in which we pit or silo Indigenous and migrant struggles from each other, one of the many things it does is erase the very real presence and struggles of Indigenous peoples who are migrating, who have historically migrated and who continue to migrate. And so I think that's also incredibly important to keep in mind when we're thinking about border struggles and migrant justice struggles. The next piece that I wanted to mention, as I alluded to earlier, was how important it is to understand, again, in the context of the southern US-Mexico border, the fundamental role that the border played historically and continues to play as a form of anti-Black control. And it was really exciting to see that folks from BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, are speaking at this conference, because they, of course, have been at the forefront of talking about the very specific impacts of immigration enforcement on Black communities. And this we can think through in a number of different ways, but just going back to the historic formation of the border, it's so important to understand the ways in which early laws that really entrenched border controls at the US-Mexico border, the southern border in the 1850s, around the time of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, at the same time that treaty was forced. We had the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And one of the things that the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act did was it really empowered vigilantes like the Texas Rangers and other border militias to start to patrol the US-Mexico border in order to keep enslaved Black people within the nation state of the United States, right? In order to ensure the continuation of the plantation economy and of enslavement, and to prevent enslaved people from fleeing into Mexico. So we see that the function of the border was not only to keep people out in terms of migrants or Indigenous peoples who are moving, or other people who are moving under different conditions, but to keep in enslaved people. And this is, I'll return to this, but it gives us an insight into the ways in which the border is fundamentally also tied up into labor, right? And so this is important to understand because the anti-Black control of movement is so central to understanding border controls. And, two writers who are located in Canada, Ronaldo Walcott and Idil Abdullahi, have written a fantastic book. And one of the things that they talk about is how the entire politics of migration is embedded in anti-Black racial logics. And to quote them, they say, movements that we now call migration are founded in anti-Blackness, taking their logic from transatlantic slavery. So, this is something that they've written. I'd encourage people to read it. But again, looking at these histories, and we start to even see antebellum and postbellum Black codes were very much about, as we know, controlling the movement of Black people, including between states, right? So so-called free states within the United States, so-called free states like California implemented some of the first interstate, by that I mean not federal regulation, but regulations between states to prevent the movement of free Black people, non-enslaved Black people into their states, because they were fearing an exodus, a quote unquote Black exodus from former slave states and or still slave states. And so this kind of control, this anti-Black control and the kind of criminalization of migration and the ways in which it's specifically linked to the construction of Blackness as vagrancy, the threat of Black freedom, the threat of Black mobility is so important to understand in the ways in which we talk about border controls. And of course, we see this most starkly, not just in the US-Mexico context at that border, but very much so in the Mediterranean, right? The world's deadliest border, the Mediterranean. But I will return to that in terms of the ways in which the Fortress Europe is actively constructed in terms of anti-Black violence. And so in the contemporary era, and again, coming back to the amazing work of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, one of the many ways in which we see anti-Black violence really being embedded, right, baked into border controls, is the ways in which there's a conflation between criminal justice and immigration legal systems. And so, those who are disproportionately impacted by deportation, particularly under the guise of criminal deportation, right? So deportation as a result of a criminal record, which, has everything to do with profiling and nothing to actually do with the law. Those are Black African and Black Caribbean migrants. And so Baji has done amazing work looking at the ways in which Black migrants are disproportionately impacted by criminal deportation proceedings. And so, we see the ways in which, again, anti-Blackness is fundamentally baked into the logic of migration and border controls. And so I say all of that as a kind of historical context to really try to bring together our understanding of these violences, the violences that we see today with respect to migrant exclusion, the kind of crisis of the borders, which I'm sure many of us would agree is not, it's not actually a crisis. The migrant crisis and refugee crisis is a crisis created by border controls, right? If there was no borders, we would have free movement and we wouldn't have these kinds of crises that are created by the state and capital. But that these kind of contemporary crises, for lack of a better word, are really historically entangled in these processes that we often see as separate, right? So specifically conquest and anti-Black and anti-Indigenous genocide, that we need to see the linkages between these struggles and the ways in which they're part of our contemporary terrain of struggle. I want to quickly move now to, that really was just for me a little bit of context for where I'm coming from in thinking through the border. And particularly border formation in the North American context, but really just to briefly expand into a global perspective and how we think about the border and what the function of the border is really, right? And I won't take too long here, but I just want to highlight four quick things in thinking through this. So the first is, of course, that we don't have, and I've said this already, we don't have a migration crisis. We don't have a refugee crisis. We have a crisis that's created by the border. And more fundamentally, we have a crisis that's been created because of immobility and displacement, right? So it's not actually that people are able to be on the move. The vast number of people on this planet, the violence that they experience is actually the violence of being immobilized, whether that's the immobility of not actually being able to move because of borders, but also the ways in which the border reproduces itself in so many different ways, right? So even the seemingly kind of benevolent technologies of the UN refugee camps, for example, those are bordered zones of containment, right? Where the vast number of displaced people and refugees live and are forcibly immobilized in this kind of liberal humanitarian project of a refugee camp. Those are also projects of immobilization. And, as so many researchers have shown, the number of refugees who are able to leave refugee camps is under 1%. So the vast number of people are actually immobilized within nation states, or at best a neighboring nation state in the so-called global south or the third world, right? Very few people make it into the borders of the advanced kind of Western economies, as they'd like to call themselves. So we need to really be thinking about the crisis of migration really as a crisis of immobility and also a crisis of displacement, right? The reasons that so many people are being displaced around the world, I'm not going to go into all of them, but I trust that people are aware of the ways in which the violence of capitalism, the violence of militarism, the violence of imperialism, the violence of economic terror, the violence of oppression, all of these forces, all of these systemic forces are creating a crisis of displacement for people, right? The fact that people do not have the ability to remain where they are, should they wish to remain where they are, because of extractive violences and imperial violences. And it is not a coincidence that the asymmetry of those who move in the ways in which people move is, again, underwritten by a historic legacy of imperial violence, right? So the vast number of people who are moving are brown and black people, people who are poor, people from peasant communities, people who are farmers, people who are forcibly impoverished, and are moving asymmetrically towards economies and countries and or urban centers even, where that are the centers of capital, right? The centers of extraction. And so this asymmetry is obvious, but important to name, because migration is not just a phenomenon of people all moving in the same way or all having equal access to movement. It's a deeply asymmetrical process about how people move and under what conditions. So that's important, I think, for us to always keep at the forefront of our minds, because a lot of times conversations about migration become very domesticated, right? It becomes a conversation between the right within nation states saying, too many immigrants, deport them all, or the kind of liberal center, which is like, no, we need more immigrants because, whatever kind of reason that they give, right? Immigrants build our economy, or we're a benevolent multicultural nation state, whatever their reason is. But rarely do we have robust, holistic debates in the public context or in public conversation about the reasons why people are on the move, right? The reasons and the ways in which Western national economies are complicit in the displacement of people, right? So whether that's through the occupations that the countries that we come from, the wars that they're waging, their corporations that are being headquartered. I live in Canada, where 75% of the world's 75% of the world's mining companies are headquartered, right? So people all around the world are impacted deeply by the violence of Canadian mining, but we don't talk about that. Right? When we're talking about migrants, for example, rarely are we implicating ourselves, and ourselves, I say that loosely, but rarely are Canadians implicating themselves in the reasons that people are on the move. And I think that is such an important part and a necessary part about how we talk about migrant justice struggles, because migrants don't just appear at our borders and then we have to have conversations about them, quote unquote. We have to implicate the violences that we are all bound up in the spaces in which we live. So that's the other thing that I wanted to mention. The last two things that I wanted to mention, and I alluded to this earlier, just the centrality of capitalism in thinking about borders, right? And so drawing here from David Harvey's work, which is, the border really is a spatial fix for capitalism. And this is really important because I think in a time of growing kind of capitalist globalization, there's a huge trend among certain aspects of the left, or the kind of Keynesian left, who really see the border as a fix to capitalism, in the sense of not a fix of capitalism, but a fix to capitalism, where they really think that calling for hardened borders will protect labor, right? So we see this in the calls by many labor unions, who call for things like no temporary workers, no migrant workers. In the Canadian context, for example, there's been a long-standing call amongst strands of the labor movement that say Canadian jobs for Canadians. This is also very common in countries that have an ostensibly kind of social safety net, whether that's countries like Canada or many of the Nordic countries who have some of the most restrictive immigration policies because their entire kind of concept of social solidarity is deeply nationalist. And so I think this is, in a time of, kind of rising overt racist nationalism, it's really important that those of us who are no borders, or those of us who are located on the left, really reject the ways in which there are strands amongst us who have a nationalist response to capitalism. And I think one of the ways in which we see this most clearly is in the struggle of migrant workers, right? So migrant workers are those who are kind of conscripted in state programs of indentureship, where the state allows migrant workers to come into the nation state. They're tied to an employer, and when their employment is no longer needed, their employment is terminated and their visa status is terminated. The Canadian kind of model of managed migration is a template for around the world, right? So increasingly, as countries are dealing with the undocumented crisis, or what they call the undocumented crisis, dealing with the refugee crisis, dealing with the border crisis, whatever name they've given it, managed migration has become a model of, okay, how do we bring in migrants that we need for their labor, right? How can capitalism continue to exploit workers without changing the entire kind of racial social organization of the nation state, right? So how can we exploit workers without giving them the permanent rights of residency, without giving them labor rights, and without allowing them to stay and be part of the communities in which they live? And there is important to note that there is nothing temporary about migrant workers, right? So in many instances, we have migrant workers, for example, in Canada, where I'm based, who continue to come to the fields and farms of this country for the past 30 years. They've essentially lived here for 30 years, but continue to be called temporary. And of course, we know that that's a deeply racialized way of thinking about people, right? When you call them temporary, both in terms of their legal status and then also their kind of racial identity, that further buttresses and affixes race to the nation state, right? So this is a deeply racist program. It's a deeply exploitative program, but it is not an anomaly. It is increasingly becoming the template all around the world. And I bring up this example again, to highlight the ways in which the border is as much about racism as it is about capital exploitation, because one of the things that the border does is not only to exclude people and to deport people, but to also make people deportable, to make people precarious, right? So you may not actually be deported, but your precarious legal status ensures that you continue to live in this kind of apartheid system of citizenship, in this kind of constant limbo with respect to your legal status. And then your legal status can, of course, be manipulated by the employer. And the state is very much implicated in this, right? This is not about a few bad employers. This is an entire state conscripted program, a state regulated program. And for me, this migrant workers is, thinking through the struggles of migrant workers and the reality of migrant worker programs is one of the many ways in which, but, it's kind of the starkest way in which we see how fundamental border controls are to capitalism, and therefore how fundamental it is for an anti-capitalist position to demand no borders, right? Because what the border does is it basically serves as a segmentation of the labor force at an international level. So in the same way that outsourcing, right? So when countries and employers and corporations outsource labor to the global south, it relies on that segmentation of labor. It relies on a cheapened labor force. I don't say cheap, I say cheapened, right? Because that's created. And in the same way, migrant workers are the flip side of that. They're the insourcing of cheapened labor and rely on the border as a way to create a category of cheapened labor. And so it is so essential that a no borders position is seen as an anti-capitalist position, because there is no way that borders will lift the wage floor for all workers. It is simply not possible. So if we want to have an anti-capitalist position, if we want to have a position in solidarity with all workers of the world, as the industrial workers of the world would remind us, then it is so important that we take on a position of no borders that is in solidarity with all workers and that sees the border as a fundamental barrier to the struggle of workers and to the struggle of laborers around the world, because the border works in the interests of capital. The last thing that I'd like to mention with respect to, a no borders politics, sorry, two things, because I said there's four. The last two things I'd like to mention, one is quick because I believe it's already been covered in the program, and I think more of us are thinking about this, is how important it is in migrant justice struggles and in no border struggles to be expansive in who we fight for and who we fight alongside. So one of the movements that I've been part of for over 2 decades is No One Is Illegal. And, we're very intentional in why we're called No One Is Legal, which is the fundamental belief that no human being is illegal, that illegality is constructed, that illegality is state violence, and also that we believe in no deportations and no detentions. By that, we don't mean some people deserve to be deported. We don't believe that some people deserve to be detained. It's a fundamentally abolitionist position. That rejects, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore would remind us, the politics of innocence, right? That when we are in liberation struggles, we're not thinking about innocence as the marker of whom we fight for, because we know innocence is the politics of innocence is completely underwritten by state violence and social hierarchies. And so, put simply, that really means rejecting the division between good and bad migrants, rejecting the idea of who is deserving and who is undeserving, and really kind of having an unconditional, and fundamentally refusing the burden and not putting the burden on people to justify their humanity, right? To not have to say, what's your story? Why did you come here? Are you deserving of refugee status? Are you deserving of citizenship? But to fundamentally say that, the ability to move, the freedom to stay is the struggle that we're fighting for. We're not fighting to justify individual people's humanity, because we are all deserving of that life. And so I think that's a really important orientation, because so much of migrant justice struggles can get caught up because so much of violence and fascism is about dehumanization, right? So we can get caught up in the counter, which is to humanize people's stories. And this is not to discount that we need to be attentive to people's stories, but to also reject the idea that people are somehow more or less deserving of our support or our solidarity based on what their story or narrative is. So, one of the principles of No One Is Legal is that, we know people lie about, their stories about why they want to stay in the nation state, because that is a survival tactic, and it's a damn good one, right? If you need to make up a story of what you had to flee in order to justify being able to remain in the nation state, that's legitimate, because the nation state is and these, constrictive laws are forcing you to kind of tell these stories that are meant to invoke pity. But that really isn't the source of political struggle. Our source of political struggle should be one that firmly rejects divisions between deserving and undeserving migrants, that rejects divisions that, for example, rely on whether you are, quote unquote, educated, come from a professional class, or white adjacent, or cis heteronormative, don't have a criminal record. All of those should not matter. And that is the fundamental principle of No One Is Legal, which is turning the gaze back on the violence of the state and the violence of the border, rather than having people have to prove their humanity. The last thing, the fourth and final piece that I wanted to touch on, is how important it is to understand the border as elastic. I think one of the kinds of pitfalls, if I may, of anti-border struggles can become about the spectacle at the site of the border itself, right? So, struggles to oppose borders, struggles to oppose border walls are so vital, but also borders are elastic. That magical line can exist anywhere. So border enforcement takes place inland, when the cops or border enforcement picks you up, at a school, whether you get picked up at a hospital. So immigration enforcement happens inland. Temporary migrant workers who are essentially in this carceral regime, right? Temporary foreign workers are held in labor camps, are often unable to leave. Those become sites where the border is enforced. And also increasingly, the border is externalized, right? And again, we see this most starkly at the borders of Fortress Europe, where the borders of Fortress Europe are not really around Europe anymore only. They're increasingly extending into the Sahel region. We see it around Australia, where Australian border enforcement is not just around Australia. It's also interdiction in maritime space. It's also, offshore detention centers, including in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and Nauru. We see this, of course, in the US as well. When Department of Homeland Security officials say that the Guatemalan border is actually now our southern border. It's not the US-Mexico border. And we see that enforcement happening with the Remain in Mexico protocols or the Merida initiative, which predates Trump, that happened under President Obama. And so I think it's important to see the externalization of borders as an escalating kind of violence of borders. And also specifically that we understand the externalization of borders as increasingly a form of global imperialism, right? So what are the conditions under which so many countries in the global south are being forced to take on the project of racial imperial management of migration? So, so many countries in the Sahel for whom now trade and aid agreements with the EU are contingent upon them building detention centers, are contingent upon them building, infrastructures of border controls, are contingent on them accepting European boots on the ground in order to prevent migration. And so I think it's important to not only implicate these kinds of dynamics of imperialism and capitalism and power, and also regional power dynamics, right? Not only in the kind of causes of migration, but also fundamentally as a pillar of global governance and migration management increasingly, right? So we're not only talking about the fortresses around kind of Western nation states, but we're seeing that those management, the kind of ways in which borders are being controlled are being externalized onto other countries and onto other nation states. Turkey, of course, is a very salient example of that as well. But I think that's increasingly important for us to pay attention to, because they really are the new frontiers of border militarization, and particularly with the merging of digital technologies and smart border technology, which is not at all smart. It's oppressive. But the kind of externalization of these technologies means that the kind of frontiers of border militarization, if we will, are not the kind of centers of power that we've traditionally struggled against, right? It means thinking through what is the role of countries like Mexico in border militarization? What is the role of countries elsewhere as well, right? Like Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Niger, et cetera. And also looking at the historical patterns of imperialism that are forcing countries and many nation states and their economies to take on these institutions of border enforcement. So those are some of the things. I know that was possibly a lot and a bit disjointed, just in the interest of time, but I did want to cover a little bit of different ground. And I will just, conclude by saying that for me, this is why a no borders politics is not simply and cannot simply be about fights against the border, but really fundamentally is about thinking how the border is bound up in our racial social organization. It is bound up in oppressive social hierarchies. It is bound up in capitalism. It is bound up in imperialism. So we can only have a politics of no borders if we have a revolutionary politics that is also deeply committed to liberation and really freedom from all forces of violence. Thank you all. Thank you for your time. And I look forward to Q&A.
Thank you so much for all of that. That was honestly, that was all gold. As what we were just saying, it was all amazing. Everything that you said was incredible. Thank you so much. So I want to go ahead and pop it on over to our Q&A. Let's see, where are you? There you are, David. Okay. But yes, thank you so much. Go ahead, David.
So I'd like to encourage our audience. Well, first, thank you for sticking around late in the day, at least here in the East Coast in the US. Feel free to write in your questions in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And we have our first question is, Harsha, what is the title of the book you referenced? I think your book. This was early in your speech.
Sure. It's called, oh my goodness, this is somewhat embarrassing. Let me, give me a second to look it up because the title. It's called Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism. There we go. Sorry, it's in its early days, so it's hard to remember. And it's available through Haymarket.
And our next question is from, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Jerome, with Ghent Without Borders, who says, I'm active in a local group fighting the border imperialism of Fortress Europe. One constant struggle is to try to get more people who are spending time to get limited reforms or who do admirable direct support work to get them to organize around more ambitious, non-reformist reforms that set us on the road to border abolition. Many supporters agree in principle, but are discouraged because of the need for direct support work, because of opposition, and because they don't believe that we can win. How do we address this challenge in our organizing?
Oh, such a good question. And you know, in my view, that's really a question that all organizers struggle with, right? Is like, how do we balance the broader struggles and the kind of visionary goals that we have, whatever kind of revolutionary vision that we have, you know, whether it's border abolition, prison abolition, you know, an end to militarism, et cetera, and the very kind of more immediate, struggles, whether that's direct support or trying to struggle for non-reformist reforms, right? And here I trust that, you know, without going into detail, that we have some kind of working understanding of the difference between non-reformist reforms, which really work to expand the possibility of freedom and take us towards the path, versus reformist reforms, which re-entrench the status quo. And so, you know, there are many necessary fights in the vein of non-reformist reforms that builds towards the long view and the long goal. But really and like you said it perfectly, right? We're all kind of in agreement, but it really is about trying to do all at the same time, which we're so limited by. And I don't think that there's an easy answer, because like I said, I think that is the struggle of all organizing. But perhaps I can offer some very few pieces from my experience, and I'd be keen to hear about others too. You know, one is that we just have to find ways to increase our capacity. It is impossible to be small kind of collectives doing work and trying to tackle all this, right? Like the shit is huge. And we're small collectives. So how do we scale up? How do we multiply? How do we increase our capacity without becoming the nonprofit industrial complex? Like all of that. How do we build mass movements that have power? You know, that is a question for all of us. The other piece in terms of I actually think engaging in non-reformist reform campaigns are important. You know, again, they increase the possibility of freedom, so they don't detract from our goal. But I think they are the things that help bring people in, right? People want to feel and need to feel inspired. We all need to feel that we're contributing. We're contributing to like just straight up the betterment of our communities, right? We want to see concrete ways in which we're mitigating violence. And so I think really thinking critically through an organizing lens about, you know, tactics and strategies and goals, and really doing that work of how to build campaigns that connect to our broader vision is really important work. And here, if I can offer something, one of, as was mentioned in my bio, the first book that I wrote was a really humble project. The other one is too, called Undoing Border Imperialism. And one of the things that I most love about that book is that there's roundtables with other organizers where people are trying to hash out these very questions that you're posing, right? Like, how do we balance the broader struggle with the immediate struggle? How do we build power? How do we think strategically about our campaigns? And so if that's a resource, and there's so many others as well, please feel free to take a look at it.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Shika Dalmia, one of our previous keynote speakers today. And she asks, regarding the apparent tension between the systemic use of state and social violence to procure cheap involuntary labor under slavery, and the restrictionist regime currently engaged in the same systemic use of state and social violence to spurn cheap voluntary labor. Does this suggest that there is something other than economics driving immigration policies, rather something socio-cultural? If so, what is that?
Sorry, I'm going to have to read this. There's a lot there. Somewhat ironic. Are they able to maybe speak to this question? I'd love to understand it more.
Sorry, it can be followed up in writing, but not verbally, given the webinar format.
Got it. I'll try my best. I think that there are huge differences between slavery and the current kind of regime of labor. I won't have time to go into it, but I think that there are huge differences. There are differences between enslavement and indentureship, not just from the lens of labor, including the lens of labor, but also way beyond that. The social control of enslavement is different, and I don't think enslavement can be reduced to labor at all. So I think that is different. The restrictionist regime is engaged in the same thing to spurn cheap voluntary labor. Yeah, that is true, but I don't know that I understand this piece around something sociocultural. I'm a little bit anathema to understanding broad patterns through a kind of cultural lens, if you will. And by way of example, the kafala system in the Gulf states has often been, by kind of liberal commentators, understood through the kind of quote unquote cultural lens, right? So the idea that kafala is, so the kafala system, for those who are unfamiliar, is essentially, a process of indentured laborship, can include, the idea between voluntary and involuntary is a thin one, right? What are the conditions under which one moves voluntarily, and what is essentially coerced movement out of desperation? But the kafala system is one where workers are indentured to their kafil, their sponsor. It's very similar to many other programs of indentured servitude and labor, but it's quite heightened because so much of the Gulf states, the GCC states in particular, rely on migrant workers, right? There's a whole historic state formation, and specifically the enmeshing of oil as a global commodity, and the geopolitical role that the region plays in imperialism and capitalism is so unique. But really, there's been many studies that have for a long time implicated the kind of kafala system, or have justified the kafala system under these kinds of banners of sociocultural phenomenon. So pointing to the kind of particular hospitality or inhospitality of Arab nation states, or even tried to tie it to the Sharia system, to Islamic law. And I really reject those. I follow here in the vein of people like Adam Haniya and others who really implicate capitalism and imperialism as the main drivers, as the main kind of forces that are structuring labor migration today. And that kind of attempts to exceptionalize and implicate culture, I think, are limiting for the reasons for the reasons that they tend to fall flat. They tend to often be, frankly, offensive. And that they don't see a trajectory or a relationship between various structures, right? So by kind of isolating the kafala and focusing on the kafala and Islamic law, we tend to cleave that violence and to cleave that structure from other structures like Canada, right? There's actually not that much difference between Canada's system. There are differences of degree, and again, the specifics of the economies of each nation state. But most people would not see Canada and the kafala system the same at all. But I would argue that they're actually quite similar, and that fundamentally they rely on the same kind of violence and structures. But in the kind of international arena, Canada is seen as like the Rolls Royce. That's literally what it's called. It's called the Rolls Royce. And the kafala is denounced as modern day enslavement. But I'd say we can't really, that there's a continuum and a trajectory that are very similar, and tending towards cultural explanations tends to obscure those similarities. I hope I've answered the question. I wasn't sure what the question was, but I answered it in the best way that I understood it.
Thank you. I think it was responsive. Next question is, are you familiar with any organizations that are fighting for the liberation of Indigenous people within this No Borders movement?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. I don't, the first thing that I'll say, and I, don't in any way intend for this to be self-referential, but it is. But the known as illegal movement, what we fundamentally believe is no one is illegal. Canada is illegal. And it comes from a deep commitment to fighting alongside and recognizing Indigenous struggles and Indigenous nationhood and Indigenous sovereignty. And that's in this context, but there are, of course, many others. I'd point to folks in the States, like I mentioned, Red Nation, folks that they're partnered with. I'm less familiar with the US context, but I will say that Red Nation works closely with a number of migrant justice organizations where there is an alliance, a deep alliance between migrant justice, anti-border movements, and the liberation of Indigenous peoples. I'd point folks to there as well.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Slow me down. Thank you.
It's been happening for a little bit, so I just want to I have to do this now. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that, and thank you to the interpreters. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And our next, and I believe final question is from Azadeh Irfani. It makes a lot of sense to abolish borders when those borders were drawn by colonial or imperial nation states. But how do we balance that in relation to Indigenous liberation and independence movements where there is an active effort to protect from territorial infringement?
Yeah, and it's a great question and could be a talk in and of itself. From my view, a lot of this really is really this is like the politics of liberation on the ground, right? There's no other way to answer this than this is the struggle on the ground. And the fact that I think a lot of times the kind of contradictions between no border movements and Indigenous liberation struggles, I'm simplifying a bit, but I think they tend to exist more in the kind of theoretical realm than they do on the ground, which is that, a lot of Indigenous communities are also thinking through what it means to welcome folks, for lack of a better word. What does it mean to recognize that we are bound up in these violences together? And that, again, we can't only think about the formation of borders as territory. We also need to be thinking about it in relationship to, again, capitalism and racial social organization and more. And by way of example, one example is, in the context of the Palestinian liberation struggle, where there's, increasingly and deep alliances being built between the struggles of Palestinians and African migrants who are detained and contained in the Zionist state of Israel, right? And so these kinds of relations and the relationships between struggles may seem antithetical to each other between, the defending one's territory, as was said, and or free movement. But this really is about a shared struggle against power. It's about a shared struggle against imperialism. It's about a shared struggle against colonialism and capitalism. And so those contradictions collapse a little bit more, if I may, in the context of lived experience and in the context of actual community struggle. And again, I've had that same experience in the context of being a migrant justice activist who believes in no borders, and deeply committed and fighting alongside Indigenous land defenders. The kind of articulation that I'll hear in the context of, being up at land blockades and land defense blockades is, like, kick out this mine, kick out the colonizers. And again, as Red Nation said, no one is legal except those who stole it. That's implicating a dynamic of power, not presence. And I think those are different things.
Thank you so much. I will turn the time back over to Jamila to close us out.